talking about extending Ethereum with metatransactions. So, yep, that's me. If you want to follow me on Twitter or follow my project, RAILGUN. Yeah, what are metatransactions? So in Ethereum right now, natively, you've only got one transaction type, which expects a key pair, so public-private key and an address, and it expects you to have some ETH in that address in order to submit the transaction. But what metatransactions let you do is kind of shoehorn different transaction types into Ethereum using a standard Ethereum transaction as a carrier. So if you wanted to have transactions, say, where you weren't using ETH to pay for the gas fee, or you wanted to have a multi-sig or various other things, you'd use a metatransaction. So if we look at a simple smart contract wallet as a bit of an intro to how metatransactions work, yeah. So first of all, if we have a wallet, a smart contract wallet just with a key pair, we're not doing anything special. We just want a metatransaction. We could take a set of instructions for the smart contract wallet to do, sign that with a private key, so similar way to how you'd sign a regular ETH transaction. But yeah, take that transaction rather than submit it yourself. You'd submit it to a relayer, which would wrap it in a regular ETH transaction and submit it on chain. So how do we sign these transactions? A regular ETH transaction has, if you think of it as sort of like an envelope, right? You've got a to address, so where do you want to send the transaction to? You've got a value, so if you want to put a little bit of like money in the envelope for the person that you're sending it to, or in this case, some ETH. The data is kind of the sort of like the letter that you put inside the envelope, so what do you want to pass on to it? So if it's sending it to a smart contract, you'd send your like function call, like, hey, if it was to like a DEX contract, you say, hey, I want to trade token A for token B. And we can kind of skip over the nonce, gas price, and gas limit. And we've got the signature, which essentially just takes all of the above details, hashes them all, and proves that you, as the holder of the private key, intended to take these particular actions. So it kind of acts as a seal on the envelope so that people know where it's from and it hasn't been tampered with. In a metatransaction, broadly, you've got three different components. So you've got the data, whatever you want to pass on to your smart contract wallet. You've got, because obviously, if I'm taking your transaction and I'm your metatransaction, and I'm wrapping it as a relayer, if I'm wrapping it in a regular ETH transaction to submit on chain, I'm paying gas for that. So I'm not going to do this for free. It costs me. So I'm going to want to see some sort of financial incentive. So that'll be the reward there. And then broadly, you've got requirements. So in the case of a simple smart contract wallet, this would just be a signature from a key pair. But there's a lot of other interesting requirements that you can put in there, which we can get to later. So the most obvious use case for metatransactions would be multi-sigs. So Nonce Safe is a fairly well-known multi-sig wallet. And we can go through a on-chain, like real-world example of doing a trade on 0x for with a metatransaction with a Nonce Safe wallet. So first of all, that's a URL to the 0x API, and you've got an example response there. So you'd go off, fetch your trade details from the 0x API. That's got two data and value fields. And I can go over into Gnosis safe. My 2 goes into the contract address. Value goes into the value field, obviously. And it's not very visible on the projector there, but at the bottom, there's the data field with the long hex string in there. So that's the contents of my meta-transaction, which I can then submit wrapped in a regular transaction to my Gnosis Safe smart wallet. And if we look at the transaction in Etherscan, and we decode the data that gets passed to the Gnosis Safe smart wallet, this is what we get. So we can see the 2 value at the top there is to the 0x swap router. The value is, again, what I set. And the data there is also the same as what I passed in. But the interesting thing is, if we look at the bottom, we see the signatures field. So that's the requirements field from the previous slide that we talked about here. And this basically, in Gnosis, the requirements that you satisfy is, hey, if I have a multisig, which is 3 of 5, then I should have 3 signatures there from different wallets or different key pairs from that 5 signatory set that I've set my Gnosis Safe up with. But we can also take meta-transactions and use them for, rather than just a multisig, we can push it even further and actually use it to introduce private transactions into Ethereum. So I guess this is a good point, a good place to explain just broadly what a snark is. So a snark is a way of proving that something's true without necessarily revealing all of the information. So the most common example I've heard used is if I have a Where's Wally book, and I know where Wally is, but I don't want to tell you where Wally is. I just want to prove to you that I know where Wally is. So what I could do is I could take my Where's Wally book and get a big piece of card, poke a hole in that piece of card, and position that hole so that it's over where Wally is. You, as a verifier, can look through the hole and see, yeah, the Wally's in there. But because you can't see the rest of the book, you can't actually gain for yourself the information of where Wally is. You just know that I know where Wally is, right? So we've got this sort of like, you've got the bigger picture and this hidden information that I can prove to you something about without necessarily revealing everything, right? We can think of a signature as a form of zero-knowledge proof. So the hidden information here is the private key. I mean, obviously, I don't want to reveal to you what my private key is. But I want you to know, as a chain validator or a miner, that I do indeed know the private key. So a signature is a way of showing, hey, I know that private key value, and we'd have some other data that we sign as a way of saying, okay, I know this private key value, and I want to prove that I know this private key value with the intent of taking some particular actions or submitting a transaction. A snark, we can take that and kind of generalize it so that rather than just proving that I know a private key, I can prove any sort of arbitrary fact. So the simple way of inserting a snark in here would be to just take the signature from our Ethereum transaction and replace it directly with a snark proof. That's perfectly valid. That'll work, but it's not really all that useful. I'm going to do something a bit more useful. So what else can we prove? We can prove that I have an address with some balance, and I correctly subtracted from that balance a certain number of coins. I can prove that to your address, if I was sending it to you, I correctly added some coins to your balance, and I can prove that the amount of coins I subtracted from my address and the amount of coins I added to your address is the same value. So in the system, right, we've basically gone and proved, without revealing the balances of any individual address, we just proved that the basic kind of rules around a transaction system that you want hold true. And of course, the last one, prove that I have the private key for a particular address, because we don't want anyone to be able to spend. We only want person that owns the address to be able to spend. So all this really says is, hey, I'm a transaction and I'm valid. And really the only thing that a blockchain validator or a miner cares about is it's just transaction valid. So they don't really need to see any of the other details on there. They can be satisfied with just a SNOC proof. And this is really great for a private balance to a private balance transaction. But if we wanted to do private balance to an arbitrary smart contract, we're going to have to add a bit more detail into our SNOC proof. So we essentially want to take our SNOC proof and say, hey, I am a transaction and I am valid, but only if you execute these other steps as well. So we can take a look at this in the real world with a private DEX trade using RAILGUN and trading on the 0x DEX. So the first thing that I do is I'd open up my wallet and hit swap. And in this case, I'm swapping 0.5 ETH for however much DAI that ends up being to whatever decimal places. And my clicker no longer works. Can we, next slide, please? Great. So under the hood, it does the same steps as when we were interacting with the Gnosis Safe smart contract, or the Gnosis Safe wallet. We fetch the 2 data and value. We hit next slide. And there's a lot of details there, but that's how it looks when it's submitted on chain and the values that are submitted there. If we hit next slide. But crucially, we can see there's 3 on the left. There's 3 sets of 2 data and value fields there. The one highlighted is kind of the key one there. That's the one that actually executes the trade. And I happen to know that the one on top executes or creates a token approval for the trade to occur. And the one at the bottom is a deposit back into a particular balance. OK, clicker's working again. Cool. So let's look at some notes around transaction relaying, because we've seen how a metatransaction or how a user-side wallet would interact with a metatransaction. But there is a little bit in the middle there where I need to take this metatransaction and get it on chain. So in order for me to do that, I use a relayer. And it might seem that a relayer's job, like conceptually, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, all I do is I just take a transaction and I sign it. But there's actually a couple of challenges with running a relayer or even developing it. So if you're interested in creating metatransactions or a metatransaction system, these are a few things that you might want to keep in mind. One, chains. I mean, start with the last one there, volatile gas. If you're unlucky enough to submit a transaction just when someone decides to drop the latest new NFT mint, gas spikes, and I mean, you've just submitted your metatransaction, and it's like sitting there in the mempool, right? And then you've got these kind of inconsistent wait times because you're not sure, there might be a backlog if the network's particularly congested, and you're waiting a while for your transaction to confirm. And all this while you're waiting, your relayer's ETH transaction or your ETH wallet is tied up waiting for this transaction to confirm, so you can't relay anyone else's transactions in the meantime, right? So how do you handle this? This gets a little bit technical, but basically, you got to do like nonce handling on your own. What is a nonce? So a nonce is basically it tells the Ethereum network what order of transactions were submitted from your account, and it's a way of preventing replays. But it gets a bit hairy for us because we can only ever submit one transaction with a particular nonce, and miners need to submit transactions sequentially in order of nonces. So like a nonce is a number, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I've got a transaction, say transaction with nonce 4 with a low gas price, and a transaction with nonce 5 with a really high gas price, even though the gas price of transaction number 5 is high, it's still waiting for transaction number 4 to confirm. And so you end up with this queue buildup. So the way that you handle this is you essentially say, hey, well, this is transaction number 4. It's been waiting for a while. I'm actually going to take what I was going to submit as transaction number 5 and submit it as transaction 4 with the higher gas fee so that that transaction will go through. And our transaction 4, which has a low gas fee, that can get resubmitted as transaction 5 and go back into the waiting queue. So that's a couple of ways that you can kind of mitigate this. There's a lot of complexity around handling, and now you've got to tech that, and resubmit and everything. So there is a lot of edge cases you need to think about, but this is probably the most common problem that you're going to face. Another thing that you're going to find a lot with your metatransaction system is Mempol attacks. So what is a Mempol attack? If I have a metatransaction and it's waiting in the Mempol to be mined, that's visible to anyone, including bad actors. And if my transaction is vulnerable to a Mempol attack, a bad actor could take that transaction, change some of the values in it. So if I was sending, 1 ETH to my buddy, Bob, let's say, and a attacker were to see that transaction, and they could take that transaction, alter the to address, so that it's no longer going to my buddy Bob, it's going to their own address, which is not desirable. So that's way that we'd fix that is if we look at a regular ETH transaction, right? We've got a signature which signs all of these fields, but essentially we can consider that as like binding those fields to the validity of the transaction. So if I change any of these fields, then when I submit the transaction, the signature doesn't validate, so it's no longer a valid transaction. Only the original values can be submitted. So we've got 2 data value fields for a regular ETH transaction, but we've got the data and reward fields for your meta transaction, which you'd have your whatever arbitrary steps you want in your data, and of course you want to sign the reward because you don't want the relayer to alter how much they get from you for submitting the transaction. You only want to really, you want to make sure that you know ahead of time how much you're paying the relayer, right? So if you look at the Railgun transaction from before, the way that this is handled is we've got this transactions.bound parameters. So this is a hash of all of the calls values that we saw at the bottom. And this is included as part of the snark proof. So what essentially happens is if someone were to say, rather than swapping my ETH for DAI, they went off and created some random token, created a liquidity pool for it with almost no liquidity, and then just changed your transaction to buy into their liquidity pool, and then they withdrew the liquidity and stole your ETH. That's not great. So by binding it to the snark proof, which is in essence the same as binding it to a signature by signing those values in your signature, you prevent people from being able to take those parts of your transaction and alter them and potentially steal funds. Okay, transaction reuse. There we go. Transaction reuse. So if I have a meta transaction and I submit it, that's, of course, valid. But what makes it invalid after it's been submitted, right? If there's nothing that makes it invalid after it's submitted, then someone could say, oh, you sent me 1 ETH. Well, you have 50 ETH in your address. I'll let the 1 ETH transaction confirm, and then I'll submit the same thing again. I'll get 2 ETH, do that 50 times. I've drained your wallet, and I've stolen 49 ETH from you, right? That's not a good outcome. So how do we handle that? Right. So in native Ethereum transactions, the nonce is used, which ensures that a transaction with a particular nonce can only be, so if you submit a transaction with, say, nonce 4, you can never submit another transaction with nonce 4 again. And you can never submit a transaction with 3, 2, or 1 as a nonce.